When we think of gladiators, we imagine roaring crowds, flashing steel, and the blood-soaked sand of the Colosseum. But behind the thrill of the games was a darker truth, a system of punishment so brutal, it made even the fiercest warriors tremble. These weren't just beatings or executions. They were carefully crafted spectacles of suffering, punishments designed not just to kill, but to break the spirit, send a message, and terrify everyone watching. From flesh-ripping hooks to blazing death machines, these were the horrors gladiators feared most. This is the terrifying story of pain and control. In the shadow of the roaring crowds and the towering marble of Rome's grand arenas, a darker spectacle unfolded, one far removed from the glory and cheers that echoed through the Colosseum and amphitheaters across the empire. Before the first clash of swords, before the roar of the crowd could drown out the cries of pain, gladiators faced a world steeped in cruelty and fear. They were warriors forged not only by combat, but by the relentless torment designed to break their spirits long before their bodies gave way. These were the early tortures, the punishments and humiliations that struck dread deep into the hearts of the men who would fight and die for Rome's twisted entertainment. Gladiators were not born heroes. Many were slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war, stripped of dignity and freedom, thrust into a life where their survival depended on both their strength and their will to endure unimaginable suffering. Their training grounds, known as ludus, were harsh schools where discipline was enforced through pain and fear. The trainers, or laniste, wielded not only the whip, but a set of brutal punishments intended to keep the gladiators obedient and physically hardened. Yet, beyond the lash, Rome's methods of torture extended into psychological warfare tools designed to erode morale before the blood ever touched the sand of the arena. One of the earliest and most common forms of punishment was scourging, a savage ritual of whipping that left gladiators broken and bleeding. The scourge itself was a cruel instrument, a leather whip embedded with iron or bone, capable of shredding flesh and tearing muscle. Public scourging was not merely about punishment, it was spectacle. The crowd watched as these men, who would soon be expected to embody strength and valor, were stripped naked and flogged mercilessly. This was a warning to them, and to others, of the price of disobedience and failure. But scourging served a dual purpose. Beyond punishment, it was a form of brutal conditioning, toughening the gladiators' bodies and minds against the agony to come. Chains and manacles were another method employed to strip gladiators of their humanity. When a gladiator was caught trying to escape or disobeying orders, they were shackled in heavy iron chains, forced to march or train with the weight pulling them down. These chains were a constant reminder of their captivity and subjugation. In some cases, gladiators were paraded through the streets, bound and humiliated, their dignity crushed before the eyes of Roman citizens. Such displays reinforced the message that they were nothing more than property tools of entertainment, whose lives were expendable. But Roman cruelty was not satisfied with physical pain alone. The psychological torment imposed on gladiators was as devastating as any wound. A common practice was to isolate those who had failed or shown weakness, confining them in dark, cramped cells for days or weeks. Deprived of sunlight, companionship, or hope, many fell into despair long before facing their next battle. The fear of isolation and the unknown gnawed at their minds, breaking down resistance in ways that weapons never could. Public humiliation extended beyond scourging and chains. Gladiators could be forced to wear grotesque masks or costumes, transforming them from fearsome warriors into objects of ridicule. Some were paraded naked through crowded streets, jeered at by children and citizens alike. These acts stripped them not only of pride, but of the psychological armor necessary to face combat. It was a deliberate strategy, turning men into shadows of themselves, so that when they stepped into the arena, their only refuge was the fight itself. Even the food and living conditions were tools of torment. Gladiators were often subjected to starvation or cruel dietary restrictions designed to weaken them physically. Their quarters were overcrowded and unsanitary, breeding illness and despair. Medical care was minimal and only administered when necessary to keep a gladiator fighting, not to heal or comfort. Every element of their existence was controlled, manipulated to create a constant state of vulnerability and fear. Yet, amidst this brutality, some gladiators found ways to endure and even thrive. Stories passed down through Roman history tell of men who faced scourging with silent defiance or met their chains with unbroken resolve. They became symbols of resilience, their spirits forged in the crucible of pain. The Lyniste recognized the value of such fighters, for the crowd craved not only the spectacle of death, but the drama of survival against all odds. The early tortures also served a darker social purpose. They reinforced the rigid hierarchy of Roman society. By displaying the suffering of gladiators so publicly, Rome's elite reminded citizens of their own power and control. Gladiators were living proof of the empire's might, the ability to command life and death over those deemed inferior. These punishments were as much about reinforcing social order as they were about preparing men for combat. One infamous form of punishment, reserved for those who disobeyed or tried to escape, was the carcer or prison cage, a cramped iron enclosure where gladiators could be confined for days without food or water. The psychological torment of such confinement was immense. Surrounded by cold metal bars and plunged into darkness, the prisoner's mind became a battlefield of its own, where hope withered and madness lurked. This cage was not just a prison. It was a crucible meant to crush willpower before the gladiator ever faced the sword. In some ludus, gladiators were subjected to the practice of tethering, where they were chained to walls or posts during training or punishment, forced to endure the slow agony of immobility and exposure. This form of torture was both physical and mental, breaking down resistance and reinforcing submission. The constant reminder that they were prisoners, helpless and at the mercy of their masters, fueled a cycle of fear and obedience. Through these early tortures, the Roman world forged gladiators, who were not only skilled fighters, but broken men. The cruelty they endured was a form of psychological warfare that shaped every aspect of their existence. Their pain became a spectacle for the masses and a warning to anyone who might dare challenge the authority of Rome. Before the clash of swords and the spray of blood, the gladiator's greatest battle was often against the terror of what awaited him long before he stepped into the arena's sands. Once a gladiator had survived the initial punishments and entered the brutal world of the ludus, their torment was far from over. The Roman masters of cruelty devised increasingly cruel methods to break the will and body of these fighters. The goal was not only to discipline, but to instill a deep-rooted terror both for the gladiators themselves and for the watching public who reveled in their suffering. The punishments grew more intricate and vicious, combining physical agony with psychological torture to forge combatants who were both terrified and obedient. One of the most feared punishments was the crucifixion, a slow, agonizing death reserved mainly for slaves and traitors, but sometimes inflicted on gladiators who betrayed their masters or fled. The victim was nailed or tied to a wooden cross and left to suffer for hours or days, exposed to the elements and the jeers of the crowd. The pain was unimaginable, the body racked by cramps, thirst, and suffocation as the lungs struggled to expand. While crucifixion was usually a death sentence, the mere threat of it cast a shadow over the gladiators' lives, a terrifying reminder of what awaited the most rebellious. Another brutal form of torture involved the use of scaffolding and spikes. Gladiators who broke strict training rules or attempted escape were sometimes chained to wooden frames or scaffolds, their bodies stretched painfully, limbs pulled taut by ropes or chains. Sharp spikes or nails were embedded beneath their skin or near sensitive areas, causing constant, unbearable pain. This form of punishment was not only physically torturous, but psychologically tormenting victims lived in constant agony. With no relief, their every breath a reminder of their suffering. But the cruelty extended beyond the physical. The Roman masters understood that the mind could be shattered even before the body gave in. To this end, gladiators were subjected to elaborate public humiliations meant to erode their dignity and spirit. For example, Some were forced to perform humiliating tasks in front of the crowds, forced to crawl on their knees, dance like fools, or act like animals, complete with mock chains or ridiculous costumes. These dehumanizing acts were designed to remind both gladiators and spectators that these men were nothing more than entertainment, mere playthings for Rome's amusement. In addition, gladiators who showed any sign of weakness were deliberately isolated. Removed from their peers and training groups, they were left alone in tiny, dark cells where silence and loneliness became weapons in themselves. Days or even weeks in these conditions could drive even the strongest minds to despair. The isolation was meant to erase any sense of identity or hope, leaving a broken shell who would obey without question once returned to the ludus. One of the most insidious psychological tortures was the constant threat of decimation. Originally a military punishment, decimation involved selecting every 10th man from a group and executing him as a warning to others. In the gladiator schools, the threat of similar mass punishments hung over disobedient or underperforming groups. Gladiators knew that a single mistake could bring death not just upon themselves, but upon their comrades. This paranoia bred mistrust and fear, fracturing any bonds of brotherhood that might have offered comfort or strength. The food gladiators were given often added to their torment. They were fed a diet deliberately designed to keep them strong enough to fight, but never healthy or comfortable. Cheap grains, dried fruits, and little protein meant that many suffered from nutritional deficiencies, weakened bones, and chronic fatigue. Some accounts even describe gladiators being fed certain herbs or substances that caused stomach pains or other ailments, ensuring that they were never truly well. Medical treatment, though available, was harsh and pragmatic rather than compassionate. Gladiators were treated with a mixture of herbal remedies and crude surgeries to keep them in fighting shape. Doctors in the ludus were more concerned with patching wounds to keep the gladiators alive for the next battle than with true healing. Infection was common, and many men fought through pain and injuries simply because their lives depended on it. In some extreme cases, gladiators were subjected to forced endurance tests, long, grueling sessions where they were made to train without rest, pushed to the brink of collapse. These tests often included exposure to harsh weather, forced marches in heavy armor, or wrestling matches against multiple opponents in rapid succession. The goal was to break their bodies and minds so thoroughly that only absolute obedience and raw survival instinct remained. But perhaps the most cruel aspect of the gladiators' suffering was the constant uncertainty. Every day could bring new punishments, fresh humiliation, or the ultimate test in the arena. The unpredictability was designed to prevent any sense of safety or control. Gladiators lived in a perpetual state of anxiety, never knowing if they would be forced to endure another round of scourging, chained to a post, or worse. Among the many instruments of torture, the furca, a wooden forked frame, was particularly feared. Gladiators were sometimes made to carry this heavy yoke on their shoulders as a punishment. The furca was both a symbol of shame and a tool of physical torment. The burden strained muscles and joints, making every movement painful. This punishment was meant to humble the proudest warriors, reminding them that their freedom was an illusion. To break the gladiators' spirits, masters often employed mock executions. Gladiators could be brought to the brink of death cut, wounded, or suspended only to be pulled back at the last moment. The psychological impact of surviving such a near-death experience was profound, leaving the men trembling and haunted. It was a cruel game, a manipulation of hope and despair that left scars deeper than any blade. Despite all this cruelty, some gladiators managed to develop remarkable mental strength. Tales of fighters who faced torture without a cry or who refused to betray their comrades spread through the ludus. These stories inspired other gladiators, creating a flicker of defiance amid the darkness. Yet, even these heroes were constantly tested, their endurance pushed to the limits by masters who knew that fear was the most powerful weapon in their arsenal. This brutal regimen wasn't just about punishment or control, it was also a brutal form of preparation. Roman masters believed that only through extreme suffering could gladiators develop the toughness required to entertain the masses. The crowd craved spectacle not just of combat, but of endurance and pain. Gladiators became living symbols of Rome's power men who faced unimaginable horrors and still fought on, entertaining and terrifying in equal measure. Behind every triumphant shout in the arena lay hours, days, and weeks of torment, physical pain, interwoven with psychological cruelty. The gladiators' bodies were broken to build warriors, but their minds were the true battleground. Survival meant mastering fear itself. And in that crucible of suffering, many gladiators learned that sometimes the greatest fight was not against their opponent, but against the terror that stalked them long before the first sword was drawn. After surviving all the pain and fear during training, gladiators finally had to step into the arena. This was the real challenge, not just fighting another person, but facing dangers that tested their body and mind in every way. The arena wasn't just a place for battle. It was a place where fear and pain lived alongside the fight. Sometimes, gladiators didn't even fight other men. Instead, they faced wild animals like lions, bears, or tigers, hungry and angry, trained to attack anything that moved. Imagine being thrown into a ring with no proper weapons or armor, just hoping you don't get seriously hurt or killed. These fights were called venationes and were some of the most terrifying moments for any gladiator. If a gladiator broke the rules or tried to run away, they could be punished by being sent into the arena. With these wild animals, no chance to defend themselves, just a fight to the death. The crowd would watch and cheer as the gladiator was attacked, which was the worst kind of shame and fear for the fighters. If they survived the animals, the gladiators still had to fight other gladiators. These battles were tough and dangerous. The weapons were sharp, and the armor was often minimal. Sometimes fights lasted a long time just so the crowd could enjoy the drama and action. Gladiators fought not only for their lives, but also for their honor and, in rare cases, their freedom. Some weapons made the fights even more dangerous. For example, the cestus, a glove fitted with metal spikes and weights. Fighting with that kind of glove meant every punch could cause serious injuries. Blood flowed easily, and fights were often brutal. There were also mock naval battles, where the arena was flooded, and gladiators fought on small boats or in shallow water. These battles were very risky. Fighters could drown, get crushed between boats, or get tired and lose the fight. These water battles were like a deadly game meant to entertain the crowd. If a gladiator disappointed the crowd or the organizers, the punishments could be worse than losing a fight. Some gladiators were sentenced to be crucified in front of everyone. Some were burned, and some had to fight multiple enemies until they couldn't continue. These harsh punishments sent a clear message: follow the rules, or face terrible consequences. Despite all this hardship, some gladiators became famous heroes. People loved stories about those who kept fighting even when it seemed impossible. Some gladiators even became wealthy and famous, and a very few earned their freedom. These fighters showed incredible courage and strength in the toughest situations. But the truth is, gladiators were part of a cruel system that depended on pain and violence. The people of Rome wanted blood and excitement, and gladiators had to provide it no matter the cost. They were both heroes and victims, caught in a dangerous game where their lives meant entertainment. Even today, thinking about what gladiators went through is chilling. Their battles weren't just with swords, but against fear, pain, and the struggle to stay alive every day. Their story reminds us how power can be cruel and how some people survive even the hardest challenges. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Comment below to tell me which part surprised you the most or what topic you want to see next. Your questions and ideas will help make our history stories even better.